The silence in Buckingham Palace was deafening. For 70 years, these ancient walls had witnessed coronations, celebrations, and ceremonies that shaped a nation. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold on this gray October morning. Behind closed doors, a conversation was taking place that would forever change the British monarchy. Queen Camilla, the woman who had waited decades to wear the crown, was about to discover that love, loyalty, and royal duty don't always walk hand in hand. What happened next would send shockwaves through the palace corridors and leave the nation questioning everything they thought they knew about their royal family. The morning mist clung to the windows of Clarence House like a veil of secrecy as Queen Camilla adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time. Her reflection in the antique mirror showed a woman who had learned to carry herself with regal dignity. But today something felt different. The usual warmth in her eyes had been replaced by an uncertainty that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. Charles had been unusually quiet during breakfast. Not the comfortable silence they had grown to share over their years together, but something heavier, more deliberate. He sat across from her at their private dining table, methodically spreading marmalade on his toast while his mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The newspaper lay folded beside his plate, untouched, which was unusual for a man who typically devoured the morning news with his first cup of tea. "You're awfully quiet this morning," Camilla ventured, setting down her teacup with a gentle clink against the saucer. The sound seemed to echo in the spacious room, bouncing off the oil paintings of long-dead royals who watched their conversation with painted eyes. Charles looked up, and, for a moment, Camilla caught something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was the same look he had worn years ago when they had been forced apart by circumstance and duty. A look that spoke of difficult decisions and painful necessities. "We need to talk," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. The phrase hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. Camilla felt her heart begin to race, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. They talked every day about everything from state affairs to their grandchildren's latest adventures. But this felt different. This felt final. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What's on your mind?" Charles set down his knife and leaned back in his chair, studying her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast shadows across his features, making him look older than his years. The crown had aged him, Camilla thought, just as it had aged his mother before him. "The Prime Minister came to see me yesterday evening," he began, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany table. "After you had retired for the night." Camilla nodded, remembering how Charles had excused himself from their usual evening routine, claiming he had urgent matters to attend to in his study. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Royal duties often called at inconvenient hours. "It wasn't a social visit," Charles continued, his voice growing more strained with each word. "He came with a proposal. Or rather, a strongly worded suggestion from Parliament." The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire crackling cheerfully in the ornate fireplace. Camilla wrapped her silk robe more tightly around herself, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with temperature. "What kind of suggestion?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Charles stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the carefully manicured gardens. His hands were clasped behind his back in a pose that Camilla had seen him adopt countless times when facing difficult decisions. It was his father's stance, she realized, inherited along with the crown and all its burdens. "The monarchy is facing unprecedented challenges," he said, not turning around. Public opinion polls show declining support, especially among the younger generation. The economic pressures on the nation are mounting, and there's growing criticism about the cost of maintaining the royal household. Camilla felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had been aware of the whispered conversations in Parliament, the critical articles in certain newspapers, the protests outside palace gates. But Charles had always assured her that these were temporary storms that would pass, as they always had for the royal family throughout history. "They want changes," Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Significant changes to how the monarchy operates, how it presents itself to the public, how it justifies its existence in the modern world." "What kind of changes?" Camilla asked, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. Charles finally turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "They want to return to what they call traditional values and appearances. They believe the monarchy needs to project an image that's more acceptable to the conservative elements of society who still support the institution." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. She understood the coded language, the diplomatic way of saying what they really meant. After all these years, after all the public acceptance and carefully orchestrated rehabilitation of her image, they still saw her as an outsider. Still saw her as the woman who had disrupted the fairy tale narrative they preferred to tell about their beloved princess. "They want you to distance yourself from me," she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. Charles closed his eyes as if her words caused him physical pain. "They want more than distance, Camilla. They want a complete separation. A divorce." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla felt the room spinning around her, the familiar surroundings suddenly seeming foreign and hostile. The portraits on the walls seemed to be judging her. The ancient furniture seemed to be rejecting her presence. "They believe," Charles continued, his voice breaking slightly, "that the monarchy can only survive if it returns to what they see as its core values. They want me to remarry someone younger, someone without the baggage of our past, someone who can produce more heirs and present the image of a fresh start." Camilla stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She walked to the fireplace, staring at the flames as if they might provide answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. The warmth from the fire felt mocking against the ice that had formed in her chest. "And what did you tell them?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The silence stretched between them, long enough for Camilla to hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the distant sound of gardeners working outside, the normal sounds of a life that was about to be shattered. "I told them," Charles said slowly, "that I would consider their proposal." The words hit harder than a complete rejection would have. If he had refused outright, if he had told them their suggestions were preposterous and sent them away, Camilla could have understood. But consideration meant that somewhere in his mind, he saw merit in their arguments. It meant that the man she had loved for decades, the man she had waited for through scandal and separation, was actually thinking about casting her aside for the good of an institution that had never truly wanted her anyway. "I see," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure she saw anything clearly anymore. "Camilla, you have to understand the position I'm in," Charles said, moving toward her with his hands outstretched. "This isn't about what I want. This is about duty, about responsibility to something larger than both of us." She turned to face him then, and Charles stepped back at the look in her eyes. It wasn't anger, which he might have been prepared for. It wasn't even hurt, which he had expected. It was something far more devastating, disappointment. "Do you remember," she said slowly, "when you told me that love was worth fighting for? When you said that we had waited long enough, sacrificed enough, and that nothing would ever separate us again?" Charles's face crumpled slightly at her words. "I remember. Do you remember when we married? And you promised that we would face whatever came together? That the institution would never again come between us. I remember that too." "Then, help me understand," Camilla said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "how consideration is even possible. Help me understand how the man who fought for years to make me his wife is now considering whether I'm worth keeping." The accusation hung between them like a sword. Charles opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? That the crown was heavier than he had imagined? That the pressure from Parliament, from the Archbishop, from the very foundations of the monarchy was becoming unbearable? That he was terrified of being the king who destroyed an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years? "It's not about worth," he finally said. "It's about survival. The monarchy's survival." "And what about my survival?" Camilla asked. "What about the life we've built together? Does that count for nothing in your calculations?" Before Charles could answer, a soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. The sound seemed obscenely normal given the magnitude of what they were discussing. "Enter," Charles called, his voice hoarse. A young aide stepped into the room, looking uncomfortable and apologetic. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but the Archbishop of Canterbury has arrived for his appointment. Shall I show him to the study?" Camilla and Charles looked at each other across the room. The Archbishop's arrival felt like a timer running out, a signal that the conversation they were having was about to become something more formal and irreversible. "Give us 10 minutes, Charles said to the aide, who bowed and quickly retreated. When they were alone again, Camilla felt something shift inside her. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a clarity that surprised her. She had spent years learning to navigate the treacherous waters of royal life, learning to smile when she wanted to scream, learning to be diplomatic when she wanted to be direct. But this moment called for something different. This moment called for the truth. "I won't make this easy for you," she said, her voice steady and sure. If you choose the crown over our marriage, if you choose their vision of the monarchy over the woman who has stood by your side through everything, then you'll have to live with that choice. But don't expect me to quietly disappear into the background. Don't expect me to pretend that being discarded after all these years is somehow noble or necessary. Charles stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the full strength of the woman he had married. Camilla had always been strong, but she had learned to temper that strength with royal decorum. Now, faced with the prospect of losing everything, that decorum was falling away like an unnecessary disguise. "You're angry," he said softly. "No," Camilla replied, surprising them both. "I'm not angry. I'm clear. For the first time in years, I'm absolutely clear about who I am and what I'm worth. The question is whether you are." The clock in the corner chimed softly, marking another minute passed in a conversation that was reshaping both their lives. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside these walls, a marriage that had survived decades of scrutiny was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not just the queen consort who graced official photographs and state dinners, but the woman who had loved him when he was just a troubled prince with too many responsibilities and not enough freedom to choose his own path. He saw the woman who had waited patiently while he fulfilled his duty to marry someone deemed more suitable, who had endured public humiliation and private heartbreak, who had finally been allowed to step into the light only to now be asked to retreat into the shadows once again. "I need more time," he said, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. Camilla nodded slowly, but her expression didn't change. "Time for what, Charles? Time to find a way to make this palatable? Time to convince yourself that sacrificing our marriage is somehow noble? Or time to remember who you are when you're not wearing the crown?" The aide's soft knock came again, more insistent this time. The archbishop was waiting, and, with him, the weight of an institution that had shaped British history for centuries. Charles looked between the door and his wife, caught between two worlds that seemed increasingly impossible to reconcile. "I have to go," he said, though neither of them moved. "Yes," Camilla replied. "You do? But, remember, Charles, when you're sitting in that room discussing my future as if I'm not a person but merely a political problem to be solved, that I will be here when you return. And I will expect an answer. Not consideration, not more time, but an answer. Are we partners in this life? Or am I simply another sacrifice you're willing to make for the crown?" Charles walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the threshold, he turned back one more time, seeing Camilla silhouetted against the morning light, looking every inch the queen she had worked so hard to become. "I love you," he said, the words sounding both true and inadequate. "I know you do," Camilla replied. "The question is whether that love is stronger than your fear." And, with that, Charles left to meet with the archbishop, leaving Camilla alone in a room that had witnessed the breakfast conversation that might have just ended their marriage. She stood there for a long moment, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor, wondering if this was how it would end, not with a grand gesture or dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet conversation over toast and marmalade, with considerations and consultations and the slow, methodical dismantling of a love that had once seemed unbreakable. The Archbishop of Canterbury sat across from King Charles in the oak-paneled study, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. Between them lay a leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape the very foundations of the British monarchy. "Your Majesty must understand the gravity of the situation," Archbishop Welby said, his voice carrying the weight of ecclesiastical authority. "The Church of England finds itself in an increasingly difficult position. We have supported your marriage to Queen Camilla, defended it against criticism, but the tide of public opinion is turning." Charles leaned back in his chair, the same chair his mother had used for countless difficult conversations. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now facing a crisis that echoed the very struggles that had defined his youth, the conflict between personal happiness and royal duty, between love and the demands of an ancient institution. "Public opinion has never been our primary concern," Charles replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "The monarchy has survived precisely because it rises above the momentary passions of politics." The archbishop's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes revealed a man who had wrestled with this decision through many sleepless nights. That was true in simpler times, Your Majesty. But we live in an age of social media, of instant judgment, of democratic institutions that increasingly question the relevance of hereditary privilege. On the desk between them lay polling data, newspaper clippings, and reports from the Prime Minister's office that painted a troubling picture. Support for the monarchy among young people had plummeted to historic lows. The economic crisis had made the royal family's expenses a target for public frustration. Most damaging of all, Camilla's past continued to be used as ammunition by Republican movements seeking to abolish the monarchy entirely. The situation with your marriage, the Archbishop continued carefully, has become a symbol of everything the critics find objectionable about modern royalty. The perception that the institution serves personal desires rather than national duty. Charles stood abruptly, walking to a portrait of his mother that dominated one wall of the study. Queen Elizabeth's painted eyes seemed to watch him with the same steady gaze that had guided him through childhood, that had been both blessing and burden throughout his long wait for the throne. She understood duty, he said quietly, though whether he was speaking to the Archbishop or to the portrait wasn't clear. Indeed, Your Majesty. Her late Majesty's example is why we must consider these proposals seriously. She sacrificed personal happiness for the greater good of the realm. She set aside her own desires when they conflicted with her responsibilities as sovereign. The words struck Charles like physical blows because they carried the weight of truth. His mother had given up everything for the crown. Her privacy, her freedom, even her children's childhoods had been sacrificed to the demands of royal duty. She had never wavered, never complained, never allowed personal considerations to interfere with her role as head of state and defender of the faith. What exactly are you proposing? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew. The Archbishop opened the leather portfolio and withdrew a document that had clearly been prepared with great care. The letterhead bore the joint seals of the Church of England and the Prime Minister's office, lending it an authority that made Charles's stomach tighten with dread. A dissolution of your marriage to Queen Camilla, to be conducted quietly and with dignity. Following an appropriate period of mourning for this personal loss, a strategic remarriage to a suitable candidate who can help restore public confidence in the monarchy. Charles stared at the document, noting how clinical the language was, how it reduced the most important relationship in his life to a series of legal and political considerations. You make it sound like a business transaction. In many ways, Your Majesty, that is precisely what royal marriages have always been. Strategic alliances designed to strengthen the institution and serve the national interest. Your grandmother understood this when she married Prince Philip. Your great-great-grandmother Queen Victoria understood it. Even your mother, despite her personal feelings, understood that her marriage to your father served purposes beyond their individual happiness. The Archbishop's words contained uncomfortable truths that Charles had spent decades trying to ignore. Royal marriages were indeed political arrangements, carefully orchestrated to project stability, continuity, and moral authority. His own first marriage had been exactly such an arrangement, a young, innocent bride chosen precisely because she represented the fairy tale image the monarchy needed to maintain public support. And you have specific candidates in mind? Charles asked, his voice hollow. Several possibilities have been identified, the Archbishop replied, consulting another document. Lady Catherine Mountbatten, who is 38, unmarried, and from an established aristocratic family. The Duchess of Roxburgh's eldest daughter, Lady Sarah Innes Kerr, who is 34 and has maintained an exemplary public profile, and Princess Sophia of Sweden's cousin, who is 29 and would bring valuable European royal connections. Each name felt like a nail in the coffin of his marriage to Camilla. These weren't women he knew or cared about. They were candidates selected for their ability to serve the monarchy's image needs. Young enough to bear children, aristocratic enough to satisfy traditionalists, unburdened by the scandals and complications that had defined his relationship with Camilla. Children, Charles said suddenly, understanding finally, hitting him. This is about producing more heirs. The Archbishop's expression grew even more solemn. Your Majesty, Prince William's children are precious to the realm, but the monarchy has always been strengthened by multiple lines of succession. Your brother Andrew's daughters have made choices that, while personally fulfilling, don't serve the institution's needs. Your brother Edward's children are still young. The realm would benefit from additional princes and princesses who can take on royal duties and ensure continuity. Charles felt a bitter laugh escape his lips. So my marriage to Camilla is to be ended not because we're unhappy, not because we're incompatible, but because she's 67 years old and can't provide the realm with more princes. Your Majesty, please understand that none of this is taken lightly. Queen Camilla has served with dignity and grace. She has worked tirelessly to rehabilitate her image and support your reign. But the harsh reality is that the monarchy must think in terms of decades, even centuries. Personal happiness, however genuine and deserved, cannot take precedence over institutional survival. The study fell into silence except for the steady ticking of an antique clock that had counted the minutes of countless royal crises. Charles found himself thinking about Camilla, alone in their private quarters, waiting for him to return with news that would determine the rest of her life. He thought about the morning's conversation, about the pain in her eyes when she realized what he was considering, about her final words challenging him to remember who he was when he wasn't wearing the crown. The Prime Minister supports this course of action? Charles asked. Enthusiastically, Your Majesty. The polling data shows that a younger royal marriage could boost support for the monarchy by 15 to 20 percentage points. The economic benefits alone, increased tourism, positive international coverage, renewed public engagement with royal events, could be substantial. Charles walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline where millions of people went about their daily lives, largely unaware that their monarch was contemplating a decision that felt like tearing out his own heart. In the distance, he could see the Thames flowing toward the sea, carrying with it the weight of British history, the dreams and disappointments of generations who had served the crown. There's something else, the Archbishop said quietly. Intelligence reports suggest that certain foreign powers are actively working to undermine the British monarchy. They're funding social media campaigns, supporting Republican movements, exploiting any perceived weakness in the royal family. Your marriage to Queen Camilla, because of its complicated history, provides them with ready-made propaganda material. This revelation hit Charles harder than all the previous arguments. The idea that his personal happiness was being weaponized by enemies of the realm added a dimension of urgency to the situation that he hadn't previously considered. It wasn't just about public opinion polls or newspaper headlines. It was about national security, about protecting an institution that had served as a symbol of British identity for over a millennium. What guarantee do we have, Charles asked, that sacrificing my marriage will actually solve these problems? What's to stop our enemies from simply finding new vulnerabilities to exploit? The Archbishop shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There are no guarantees in politics, Your Majesty. But the intelligence services believe that removing this particular source of criticism would significantly reduce the monarchy's vulnerability to foreign interference. A new marriage, carefully managed and properly presented, could provide the positive narrative needed to counter Republican propaganda. Charles returned to his desk and picked up the dissolution document, reading through its careful legal language. The terms were generous to Camilla. She would retain her titles, receive a substantial financial settlement, and be permitted to maintain a private residence suitable to her former station. But generosity couldn't disguise the fundamental reality. She would be discarded, cast aside after years of faithful service, reduced to a footnote in royal history. How long do I have to decide? Charles asked. The Prime Minister hopes for a decision within the week, Your Majesty. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the more speculation and rumor will grow. If we're to proceed with this course of action, it must be done quickly and decisively to minimize damage to all parties involved. A week to end a marriage that had sustained him through decades of public scrutiny and private struggle. A week to choose between the woman he loved and the institution he had sworn to serve. A week to decide whether he was primarily a husband or a king. I need to speak with Queen Camilla, Charles said finally. Of course, Your Majesty. But perhaps it would be wise to consider how much detail to share initially. These conversations must remain absolutely confidential until decisions are finalized. The suggestion that he should hide the full scope of the proposal from his own wife struck Charles as both practical and deeply dishonest. Camilla had always been his closest advisor, the person who helped him navigate the most difficult aspects of royal life. The idea of making this decision without her full knowledge felt like a betrayal of everything their marriage had meant. She deserves to know everything, Charles said firmly. With respect, Your Majesty, Queen Camilla's emotional response could cloud her judgment about what's truly best for the realm. Sometimes the kindest course is to spare loved ones from unnecessary pain during the decision-making process. Charles studied the Archbishop's face, seeing in it the same paternalistic certainty that had guided royal advisors for generations. These men, and They were almost always men who claimed to know what was best for the monarchy, what was best for the nation, what was best for everyone except the actual people whose lives they were reshaping with their calculations and strategies. Archbishop, Charles said slowly, with all due respect to your position and wisdom, you have never been married. You have never had to choose between duty and love, never had to weigh personal happiness against public responsibility. Your advice comes from books and theory and institutional tradition. My decision must come from something deeper. The archbishop's expression tightened slightly at this challenge to his authority, but his voice remained respectful. Your Majesty speaks truly about my personal circumstances, but sometimes perspective from outside a situation can provide clarity that emotional involvement obscures. The monarchy has survived for centuries precisely because individual monarchs have been willing to make difficult choices guided by advisor wisdom rather than personal inclination. And sometimes, Charles replied, the monarchy has stagnated because it valued tradition over adaptation, institutional comfort over moral courage. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door. Charles called for entry, and his private secretary appeared with a concerned expression. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but Queen Camilla has requested your immediate presence in the private quarters. She says it's urgent. Charles felt his heart rate accelerate. Had Camilla somehow learned about the specific proposals being discussed? Had word leaked despite the supposedly tight security around these conversations? Tell Her Majesty I'll be with her shortly, Charles said, then turned back to the Archbishop. This conversation must remain confidential. Of course, Your Majesty. But I hope you'll give serious consideration to the proposal. The Church of England's support for this course of action is not given lightly. We believe it represents the monarchy's best hope for long-term survival. Charles nodded absently, his mind already racing ahead to what awaited him in the private quarters. The Archbishop gathered his documents and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. Your Majesty, if I may offer one final thought. Your mother faced a similar choice early in her reign when she was pressured to distance herself from Group Captain Peter Townsend. She chose duty over personal preference, and history has vindicated that decision. The monarchy emerged stronger because she was willing to sacrifice her personal happiness for the greater good. The comparison to his mother's situation with Peter Townsend was both illuminating and troubling. That scandal had indeed been resolved by the Queen's decision to put duty first, but Charles had always wondered about the personal cost of that choice, about the happiness his mother might have sacrificed for the sake of an institution that sometimes seemed to demand everything and give little in return. As the Archbishop left, Charles sat alone in the study, staring at the dissolution documents that could end his marriage with the stroke of a pen. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, millions of people living their lives without ever having to choose between love and duty, between personal happiness and public responsibility. The urgent summons from Camilla weighed on his mind as he prepared to return to their private quarters. Whatever had prompted her request, he suspected it would force him to confront the human cost of the political calculations that filled the documents on his desk. In a few minutes, he would have to look into the eyes of the woman he loved and somehow find a way to explain why their marriage had become a problem that needed solving, why their happiness had become a threat to the institution they both served. Charles found Camilla standing at the window of their private sitting room, her silhouette rigid against the gray London sky. She hadn't turned around when he entered, and the silence between them felt charged with unspoken knowledge. On the coffee table behind her lay an open laptop, its screen displaying what appeared to be a news article, though Charles couldn't make out the details from where he stood. How long were you planning to keep it from me? Camilla asked, her voice eerily calm. Charles felt his stomach drop. Keep what from you? She finally turned around, and he saw that her face was pale but composed, her eyes holding a mixture of hurt and something else, determination, perhaps, or resolve. In her hand, she held a printed email that she extended toward him. From my private secretary, she said. It seems someone felt I should know that meetings have been taking place about my future. Meetings to which I wasn't invited, concerning decisions about my life that I apparently have no voice in making. Charles took the email with trembling hands, scanning its contents. The message was brief, but devastating in its implications. Someone within the palace had leaked information about the ongoing discussions with the Archbishop and Prime Minister. Not everything, but enough to make clear that Camilla's position as Queen Consort was under active review. Camilla, I was going to tell you everything. I just needed time to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. The full scope? Charles, they're proposing to end our marriage. What additional scope did you need to understand? He set the email down on a side table, noting how his hands were shaking slightly. There are complexities, political considerations that what? Camilla interrupted, her composure beginning to crack. That I'm too simple to understand? Too emotional to handle? Too much of a problem to be included in discussions about my own fate? The words hit Charles like accusations, and he realized that in trying to protect her from the painful details, he had instead betrayed her trust in a far more fundamental way. By excluding her from the discussions, he had reduced her to an object to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted. That's not what I intended, he said quietly. But it's what you did. Camilla walked to the laptop and turned the screen toward him. Do you know what I've been doing while you were in your meeting with the Archbishop? I've been researching. I've been reading about every royal marriage that has ended in divorce, every queen who has been set aside for political convenience. I've been trying to understand the historical precedents for what's happening to me. On the screen was an article about Henry VIII marriages, with particular focus on Anne of Cleves, who had been discarded when her foreign connections became politically inconvenient. The parallel was unmistakable and clearly intentional. Anne of Cleves was lucky, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. She was given a generous settlement and allowed to live quietly in England. She was even invited to court occasionally for ceremonial events. The king called her his beloved sister after their marriage was annulled. Charles stared at the screen, understanding the implicit question in Camilla's words. Was this what awaited her? A comfortable exile, a title without power, occasional appearances at state functions where she would be treated with polite respect but never again as an equal partner? But Anne of Cleves never loved Henry VIII, Camilla said, closing the laptop with a sharp click. She didn't wait decades for him, didn't endure public humiliation and private heartbreak to be with him, didn't sacrifice her own family relationships and public reputation to support him. Their marriage was a political arrangement from the beginning, so its political dissolution made sense. She moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back, close enough that he could smell the perfume she had worn on their wedding day and every day since. Our marriage was different, she said. Or at least I thought it was. I thought it was built on something stronger than political convenience, something that could survive the pressures that destroy marriages of convenience. Charles reached for her hands, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them that seemed to represent more than physical space. It felt like a chasm opening between two people who had once shared everything. It is different, he said desperately. That's what makes this so difficult. If I didn't love you, if this were just a political arrangement, the decision would be simple. But apparently not simple enough to actually refuse, Camilla replied. Because if you had refused their proposal immediately, if you had told them that your marriage was not negotiable, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The accusation hung in the air between them, impossible to deny because it carried the weight of absolute truth. Charles had not refused immediately. He had not defended their marriage without reservation. He had agreed to consider options that involved ending their relationship, and that consideration itself was a form of betrayal. The pressures are enormous, Charles said, knowing how weak the words sounded even as he spoke them. The monarchy is facing an existential crisis. Support is declining, particularly among young people. There are active campaigns to abolish the institution entirely. Republican movements are using our marriage as evidence that the royal family serves itself rather than the nation. So the solution is to prove them right? Camilla asked. To show that royal marriages are indeed disposable when they become politically inconvenient? To demonstrate that the monarchy treats people, even queens, as expendable accessories to be replaced when fashion changes? Charles opened his mouth to respond, but found himself without words. The logic of her argument was inescapable, and yet it ignored the larger context of institutional survival that had dominated his morning conversations. There are other considerations, he said finally. Security concerns, foreign interference, the need for additional heirs to ensure succession, heirs. The word came out like a curse. So that's what this is really about. I'm too old to produce more princes, so I've outlived my usefulness. The stark way she stated the truth made Charles flinch, but he couldn't deny the accuracy of her assessment. The proposals from the Archbishop and Prime Minister all ultimately came back to the question of children, of ensuring the royal line's continuation through multiple branches. It's not about usefulness, Charles protested. It's about the monarchy's long-term survival, which requires sacrificing the people who actually make up the monarchy, Camilla replied. How many wives can you discard before people begin to question whether the institution is worth preserving at all? She walked to a photograph on the mantelpiece, their wedding photo from 2005, taken on a day that had felt like the end of decades of waiting and struggle. In the picture, they looked genuinely happy, genuinely relieved to finally be together without secrecy or shame. Do you remember what you said to me that day? She asked, touching the frame gently. You said that nothing would ever separate us again. You said we had paid enough prices, made enough sacrifices, that we had earned the right to be happy together. Charles remembered the moment perfectly. It had felt like a promise not just to Camilla but to himself, a declaration that after years of letting duty override personal happiness, he would finally choose love over obligation. I meant every word, he said. Then, why are we having this conversation? Camilla turned back to face him, and Charles was startled to see that her tears had stopped, replaced by something harder and more determined. Why are you entertaining proposals that would break every promise you made to me that day? The question forced Charles to confront the fundamental contradiction in his position. He couldn't claim to have meant his wedding promises while simultaneously considering breaking them for political convenience. He couldn't assert that their love was real and lasting while treating their marriage as expendable. Because, he said slowly, the words feeling like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside him, I'm not just a husband. I'm a king. And sometimes those roles conflict in ways I never anticipated. I see. Camilla's voice was steady now, almost businesslike. So when there's a conflict between Charles the husband and Charles the king always wins. That's not. It's more complicated than that. Is it? She challenged. Because from where I stand, it seems quite simple. You made vows to me as a man, but you're prepared to break them as a monarch. You promised to love and cherish me as a husband, but you're considering discarding me as a king. Charles felt the weight of her words settling over him like a physical burden. She was forcing him to see the situation stripped of its political complexities, reduced to its essential moral core. Either he was a man who honored his commitments to the woman he loved, or he was a monarch who sacrificed personal relationships for institutional needs. The Archbishop mentioned your mother's situation with Peter Townsend, Camilla said quietly. How she chose duty over love, and was praised for it by history. Charles nodded, surprised that she had somehow learned about that part of the morning's conversation. But there's something the Archbishop didn't mention, she continued. Your mother never married Peter Townsend, so she never had to break vows to him. She chose duty over possibility, not duty over promise. There's a moral difference between refusing to make a commitment and breaking one you've already made. The distinction hit Charles with the force of revelation. His mother had indeed chosen duty over personal desire, but she had never been asked to violate sacred promises, never been required to abandon someone she had already sworn to love and cherish. The parallel that had seemed so compelling in the Archbishop's presentation suddenly appeared false, even manipulative. They want you to make a choice your mother never had to make, Camilla said, pressing her advantage. They want you to break vows, not just defer personal happiness. They want you to prove that royal promises are conditional, subject to political revision when circumstances change. Charles sank into a chair, feeling the weight of crown and conscience pressing down on him simultaneously. Everything Camilla was saying was true, but it didn't address the equally true fact that the monarchy was facing unprecedented challenges that required unprecedented responses. What if they're right about the political necessities? He asked. What if refusing to make this sacrifice dooms the institution that's been my family's responsibility for generations? Then, maybe, Camilla said quietly, the institution deserves to be doomed. Maybe a monarchy that can only survive by consuming the people who serve it has outlived its moral authority to exist. The words shocked Charles with their radical implications. Throughout his entire life, the preservation of the monarchy had been presented as an unquestionable good, a responsibility that justified any sacrifice. The possibility that the institution might not be worth preserving if it required abandoning fundamental principles of honor and commitment was something he had never seriously considered. You don't mean that, he said. Don't I? Camilla sat across from him, her posture straight and regal despite the personal crisis they were navigating. Charles, I've spent years learning to serve this institution, learning to smile when I wanted to cry, learning to be diplomatic when I wanted to be honest. I've accepted that my personal desires would always be secondary to royal requirements. But I never agreed to accept that royal requirements could override basic human decency. Charles looked at his wife and saw not just the woman he loved, but a person who had been transformed by her years in royal service. She had developed a strength and moral clarity that came from having been tested repeatedly by circumstances that would have broken many people. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm saying that if the monarchy can only survive by casting aside the people who love and serve it, then perhaps it's time to question whether such an institution deserves to survive. I'm saying that some things are more important than political expedience, even when that expedience is dressed up as duty and tradition." The conversation was interrupted by Charles's private secretary appearing in the doorway, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development. The Prime Minister requests an immediate audience. He says it's a matter of national urgency." Charles and Camilla looked at each other, both understanding that whatever had prompted this emergency summons was likely connected to their ongoing crisis. The outside world was beginning to intrude on what had been a private struggle, transforming their personal dilemma into a public emergency. "Tell the Prime Minister I'll see him in 10 minutes, Charles said. As the private secretary withdrew, Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that stretched beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made that would shape not just his personal life, but the future of an institution that had defined British identity for over 1,000 years. "Whatever this emergency is," Camilla said, "it's going to force your hand, isn't it? It's going to require a decision about us sooner than you wanted to make one." Charles nodded slowly, understanding that the luxury of time for reflection and consideration was about to be stripped away. Crisis had a way of demanding immediate choices, of forcing people to reveal their true priorities when there was no time for careful calculation. "Are you prepared for that?" Camilla asked. Charles turned back to face her, seeing in her eyes the same mixture of love and challenge that had drawn him to her decades ago. She wasn't asking whether he was prepared to choose her over the crown, or the crown over her. She was asking whether he was prepared to discover who he really was when forced to choose between the competing claims on his loyalty and conscience. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying. "Then," Camilla said, standing and smoothing her dress with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to maintain dignity under pressure, "I suppose we're about to find out together." The Prime Minister's arrival at the palace came with unusual urgency. Sir Keir Starmer entered the stateroom flanked by his private secretary and the director of MI5, their faces bearing the gravity of men carrying news that could reshape the British government. Charles sat behind the ornate desk that had served monarchs for 2 centuries, while the weight of the morning's conversations with Camilla pressed heavily on his mind. "Prime Minister," Charles began, "I understand this concerns a matter of national urgency." Starmer placed a red dispatch box on the desk between them, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, we've received intelligence that requires immediate action. Our sources indicate that foreign state actors have obtained detailed information about the ongoing discussions regarding your marriage to Queen Camilla." Charles felt his blood turn cold. The conversations that were supposed to remain strictly confidential within the highest levels of government had somehow been compromised. "What kind of information?" "Everything, Your Majesty. The Archbishop's proposals, the polling data, the potential candidates for remarriage, even the timeline for decision-making." The MI5 director stepped forward, opening the dispatch box to reveal photographs and documents. "We believe Russian intelligence services have been monitoring our communications and are preparing to weaponize this information." Charles examined the documents with growing horror. Intercepted communications showed detailed knowledge of private conversations that should have been impossible to obtain. Worse, the intelligence suggested that foreign powers were planning to release this information in a way designed to maximize damage to both the monarchy and the British government. "How is this possible?" Charles asked. "We're still investigating the source of the leak," the MI5 director replied. "But the immediate concern is managing the crisis once this information becomes public. And make no mistake, Your Majesty, it will become public within hours, not days." Starmer leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Your Majesty, we're facing a perfect storm. When news breaks that you've been considering divorcing Queen Camilla for political reasons, combined with the revelation that potential replacement wives have already been identified, the public reaction will be catastrophic." Charles studied the intercepted documents, seeing his private agony transformed into political ammunition. The careful language of diplomatic proposals became crude manipulation when stripped of context. The rational arguments about institutional survival appeared calculating and heartless when reduced to newspaper headlines. "What do you recommend?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew. "We need to get ahead of this story," Starmer said. "We need to announce a decision before our enemies can frame the narrative. The longer we remain in limbo, the more damage this revelation will cause." The pressure Charles had been feeling all morning suddenly intensified into something approaching panic. The choice he had hoped to make carefully, after thorough consideration and consultation, was now being forced upon him by intelligence operations and media manipulation. "And what decision do you believe we should announce?" Charles asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. Starmer exchanged a glance with the MI5 director before answering. "Honestly, Your Majesty, that depends on what story you want to tell. If you announce that you've rejected all proposals for divorce and stand firmly behind your marriage to Queen Camilla, you can frame this as a foreign attempt to undermine royal stability. The public will rally behind you against outside interference." Charles felt a flicker of hope. "And the alternative? If you proceed with the divorce proposal, you'll need to present it as a personal decision made for the good of the realm, completely separate from any foreign influence. But the timing will make that narrative much harder to sell convincingly." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Charles. The foreign interference that had been cited as a reason to end his marriage had now made ending it far more politically dangerous. His enemies had trapped him by revealing the very plots they had supposedly been preparing to exploit. "There's another consideration," the MI5 director added. "Our investigation suggests that someone within the palace leaked this information deliberately. The security breach came from inside our own institutions." The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. Someone within his own household, someone trusted with the most sensitive royal communications, had betrayed that trust to foreign powers. The implications extended far beyond his personal crisis to questions about the security of the monarchy itself. "Do we know who?" Charles asked. "Not yet, but we're close to identification. The leak appears to have come from someone with access to both church and government communications, someone positioned to observe the full scope of the discussions." Charles's mind raced through the possibilities. The list of people with such comprehensive access was small, but it included several individuals he had trusted completely. The idea that one of them might be working against the monarchy felt like a personal betrayal on top of everything else. "Prime Minister," Charles said slowly, "I need to understand something. Are you recommending that I stay married to Queen Camilla because it's the right thing to do, or because it's now the politically expedient choice?" Starmer's expression showed that he appreciated the directness of the question, even if it made him uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, I won't pretend that political considerations aren't involved. But sometimes the right thing to do and the politically wise thing to do align. This appears to be one of those moments. So if there had been no foreign interference, no security breach, you would still be recommending divorce?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Charles understood that the political calculus had changed completely in the span of a few hours. The marriage that had been seen as a liability had suddenly become an asset, not because anything fundamental had changed about its political implications, but because the circumstances of the threat had shifted. "I see," Charles said quietly. "So Queen Camilla's value as my wife depends entirely on the current political weather. When Republican movements were gaining strength, she was a problem to be solved. Now that foreign powers are attacking, she's an asset to be protected." Starmer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Majesty, I understand how that might sound, but it sounds," Charles interrupted, "exactly like what it is. A marriage being evaluated purely on its usefulness to political strategy." The Prime Minister's phone buzzed with an urgent message, which he checked quickly before his expression grew even more grave. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation has just become more complex. Our monitoring services have detected increased online activity, suggesting that the information leak will be published within the next 2 hours. We need a response prepared immediately." Charles felt the walls closing in around him. The decision that had seemed difficult but manageable that morning had transformed into a crisis requiring immediate resolution. Every moment of delay would be seen as weakness. Every statement would be scrutinized for evidence of foreign influence or political calculation. "I need to speak with Queen Camilla," Charles said. "Of course, Your Majesty, but time is critically short. The media response strategy needs to be coordinated across government departments, and That requires knowing what position you'll be taking. Charles stood abruptly, his decision crystallizing in a way that surprised him. Prime Minister, I appreciate your counsel and the intelligence briefing, but I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this crisis. All three men looked at him with expressions of puzzlement and concern. You've been treating this as a political problem requiring a political solution, Charles continued. But it's actually a moral problem requiring a moral response. The question isn't what's politically expedient in the current circumstances. The question is what's right. Starmer opened his mouth to respond, but Charles raised his hand to stop him. I've spent the morning listening to arguments about institutional survival, political calculations, and strategic considerations. I've been presented with polling data and security assessments and historical precedents. But no one has asked the most basic question. What kind of man breaks promises to the woman he loves because keeping them becomes politically inconvenient? The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock that had measured the moments of countless royal decisions. Charles could see in the faces around him the recognition that this conversation had moved beyond the realm of political advice into something more fundamental. Your Majesty, the MI5 director said carefully, personal principles are admirable, but when national security is involved, national security, Charles replied, depends ultimately on whether the institutions we're trying to protect deserve to exist. If the monarchy can only survive by abandoning basic principles of honor and commitment, then maybe our enemies are right to attack it. Charles walked to the window, looking out at the London streets where ordinary people live their lives without ever having to choose between love and duty on such a grand scale. But their smaller choices, their daily decisions about honor and commitment, were the foundation upon which the entire social fabric rested. I'm going to speak with my wife, Charles announced, and then I'm going to make a decision based on what's right, not what's politically convenient. The monarchy will either survive that approach or it won't, but at least it will have maintained its moral authority. Sir, Starmer protested, with respect, you have responsibilities beyond your personal conscience. You have obligations to the realm, to the Commonwealth, to institutions that have served Britain for centuries. Charles turned back to face them, and something in his expression made all three men step back slightly. For the first time that day, he looked fully royal, not in the ceremonial sense, but in the deeper meaning of someone who understood the weight of true leadership. Prime Minister, he said quietly, those institutions have survived precisely because, at crucial moments, individual monarchs have been willing to stand for something beyond political expedience. They've endured because they represented principles that transcended the immediate pressures of any particular crisis. But the political realities, Starmer began. The political realities will change, Charles interrupted. They always do. But the choices I make about fundamental questions of honor and commitment will define not just my reign but what the monarchy represents for generations to come. I won't sacrifice that for temporary political advantage. Charles moved toward the door, then paused and turned back one final time. Gentlemen, I understand the gravity of the situation you've described. I appreciate the intelligence briefing and the political analysis. But I'm going to make this decision as a man, not as a political calculation. Whatever the consequences, at least I'll be able to live with myself afterward. As Charles left the stateroom, he heard whispered conversations beginning behind him, urgent discussions about crisis management and damage control. But those concerns felt distant now, less important than the conversation he was about to have with Camilla and the decision they would make together about their future. The intelligence about foreign interference had revealed something crucial, but not what his advisors had intended. It had shown him that treating his marriage as a political asset to be managed rather than a sacred commitment to be honored was exactly the kind of thinking that made the monarchy vulnerable to attack in the first place. Walking through the palace corridors toward his private quarters, Charles felt a strange sense of relief. The decision was becoming clearer, not because the political calculations had simplified, but because he was finally asking the right question. Not what choice would best serve the institution's survival, but what choice would allow him to remain the man Camilla had married, the man he had promised to be when he stood with her before God, and made vows that were supposed to transcend all earthly considerations. The security crisis had forced his hand, but perhaps that forcing was exactly what he had needed. Perhaps some decisions were too important to be made gradually, through careful political calculation. Perhaps some choices required the clarity that only comes when everything else is stripped away. leaving just the essential question of who you are when everything you thought you knew about your circumstances changes in a single moment. As he approached the door to their private quarters, Charles realized that he already knew what his answer would be. The morning's conversations had been an elaborate journey toward a conclusion that his heart had reached the moment Camilla challenged him to remember who he was when he wasn't wearing the crown. Now all that remained was to tell her, and to face whatever consequences that truth would bring. Charles found Camilla exactly where he had left her, standing by the window in their private sitting room. But something had changed in her posture. She no longer looked like someone waiting for a verdict to be delivered upon her life. Instead, she appeared resolved, almost serene, as if she had reached some internal conclusion during his absence. "The emergency meeting?" she asked without turning around. "Foreign intelligence services have learned about all the discussions regarding our marriage," Charles said, closing the door behind him. "They're planning to release the information publicly within hours." Camilla's shoulders tensed slightly, but she still didn't turn around. So the private humiliation becomes public scandal. "The political calculation has changed completely," Charles continued, moving to stand beside her at the window. "The Prime Minister now believes that divorcing you would be seen as capitulation to foreign pressure. What was politically expedient this morning is now politically disastrous." She finally looked at him, and Charles was surprised to see not relief in her eyes, but something closer to disappointment. "So I'm to be saved by the same political machinations that were going to destroy me." "Camilla, no, let me finish," she said, her voice steady but weighted with something Charles couldn't quite identify. "This morning I learned that my marriage was being evaluated like a business investment, subject to cancellation when it stopped generating positive returns. Now I'm learning that I'm to be retained because cancellation has become too expensive." Charles felt his heart sink as he recognized the impossible position his morning's deliberations had created. By treating their marriage as a political calculation, he had poisoned the very thing he was now trying to preserve. "That's not how I see it," he said. "Isn't it?" Camilla walked away from the window, putting space between them again. "Charles, you spent the morning in meetings about ending our marriage. You didn't refuse their proposal immediately. You didn't tell them that some things weren't subject to political review. You agreed to consider options that would have discarded me like an outdated piece of furniture." The accusation hung between them, and Charles couldn't deny its fundamental accuracy. He had treated their marriage as negotiable, subject to revision based on political circumstances. That the political circumstances had now changed didn't alter the basic betrayal of having considered her dispensable in the first place. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "Yes, you did. But the question is what kind of mistake?" Camilla sat down in the chair she had occupied during their morning conversation, her posture formal and distant. "Was it a mistake in judgment, an error in political calculation that you've now corrected? Or was it a mistake in character, a fundamental failure to understand what marriage means, what commitment requires, what love demands?" Charles felt the weight of her question settling over him like a judgment. She was asking him to define not just his decision about their future, but his understanding of himself and what he stood for as both a man and a monarch. "The pressure was enormous," he began, but Camilla raised her hand to stop him. "Charles, there will always be enormous pressure. That's what it means to be king. The question is whether you let that pressure change who you are, or whether you use your position to stand for something beyond political convenience." She stood and walked to a bookshelf that held photographs from their years together, official portraits mixed with private moments, public ceremonies alongside quiet family gatherings. Her fingers traced the edge of a frame containing a picture from their wedding day. "Do you know what I've been thinking about while you were in your meetings?" she asked. "I've been thinking about my first marriage and why it failed." Charles watched her carefully, understanding that this conversation was moving towards some kind of resolution, though he wasn't sure what form it would take. "Andrew and I divorced because we became different people," she continued. "We grew apart, wanted different things, couldn't find common ground anymore. It was sad, but it was honest. There was no betrayal, no calculation, just two people who discovered they weren't compatible for the long term." She turned away from the photographs to face him directly. "But what you were considering this morning, that would have been different. That would have been ending a marriage not because we stopped loving each other, not because we grew incompatible, but because other people decided our love was politically inconvenient." Charles felt the distinction like a knife to his heart. She was right, of course. The proposals he had entertained hadn't been based on any failure in their relationship, but on external pressures that had nothing to do with their actual compatibility or happiness. I never stopped loving you, he said desperately. I know that, Camilla replied, her voice gentle but firm. But love isn't enough, Charles. Love without commitment is just sentiment. Love without courage is just wishful thinking. Love without the willingness to fight for it when it's threatened is just nostalgia. The words hit him with devastating accuracy. He had claimed to love her while simultaneously considering abandoning her. He had talked about their bond while treating it as expendable. He had spoken of commitment while negotiating its termination. What are you saying? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Camilla walked back to the window, looking out at the gardens where they had taken countless walks together, where they had planned their future and shared their hopes for what their marriage could become. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but filled with profound sadness. I'm saying that I can't be married to someone who views our relationship as a political asset to be retained or discarded based on current circumstances. I can't live with a man who measures the value of our marriage by polling data and strategic considerations. Charles felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Camilla, please. I'm saying, she continued, that I want a divorce. The words hit Charles like a physical blow, all the more devastating because they came not from government pressure or political calculation, but from the woman he loved, based on his own failures of character and commitment. Not because I don't love you, she said, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. Not because I don't believe in what we could have together, but because I need to be married to a man, not a political position. I need a husband, not a monarch who happens to share my bed. Charles stared at her, understanding that this was not a negotiating position or an emotional outburst, but a carefully considered decision based on what she had learned about him through the day's revelations. You don't mean that, he said weakly. I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life, Camilla replied. Charles, you had a choice this morning between being a husband and being a king, and you chose to be a king. That choice tells me everything I need to know about what our marriage means to you. But the political situation has changed. Exactly. Camilla's voice rose for the first time that day. The political situation changed, and, suddenly, I became worth keeping again. Don't you see how insulting that is? Don't you understand what it means to have your value as a wife determined by polling data and security briefings? Charles sank into a chair, the full magnitude of his mistake finally becoming clear to him. By treating their marriage as a political calculation, he had destroyed the very foundation that made it worth saving. By agreeing to consider ending it for strategic reasons, he had revealed that he didn't understand what marriage meant in the first place. I can't change what I did this morning, he said quietly. No, you can't, Camilla agreed. But you can learn from it. You can understand what it means and let it guide your decisions going forward. She walked over to him and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers for what felt like the last time. Her touch was gentle but final, carrying the weight of goodbye. I will always love the man I married, she said softly. The man who waited decades for us to be together, who fought against the entire establishment to make me his wife, who promised that nothing would ever separate us again. That man would never have entertained proposals to end our marriage for political convenience. Charles looked into her eyes and saw not anger or bitterness, but profound sadness for something precious that had been lost. But that man seems to have been consumed by the king, she continued. And I can't be married to just the king. I need the man too, and I'm not sure he exists anymore. She stood up and walked to a desk in the corner of the room, pulling out a document that she must have prepared while he was in his meetings. Charles recognized it as a formal request for divorce, already signed and dated. I've made it easy for you, she said, placing the document on the coffee table between them. No scandal, no public recriminations, no political complications. I'll cite irreconcilable differences and accept whatever settlement you think appropriate. The foreign intelligence leak will become irrelevant because we'll have made the decision ourselves, for our own reasons. Charles stared at the document, understanding that she had thought through all the implications of her decision, had considered the political ramifications, and found a way to protect both of them from the worst consequences. You've saved the monarchy from a scandal, she said with bitter irony. Just not in the way your advisors expected. Charles picked up the document with trembling hands, reading through the formal language that would end their marriage. It was generous to the point of being heartbreaking. She was asking for almost nothing, leaving him with his dignity intact and his political position strengthened. Why, he asked. Because, Camilla said, I finally understand what you taught me this morning. Some things are more important than holding on. Some principles matter more than personal happiness. Some truths are worth accepting even when they break your heart. She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I'll be staying at my house in Wiltshire for the time being. My staff will coordinate with yours about the practical arrangements. I think it's best if we don't see each other during the transition period. Camilla, wait. She turned back one last time, and Charles saw in her face the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago, the woman who had possessed the strength and dignity to endure everything their relationship had cost her. You asked me this morning what I was worth, she said quietly. I know now. I'm worth more than being treated as a political asset. I'm worth more than being retained or discarded based on strategic considerations. I'm worth more than being married to a man who can't tell the difference between love and political convenience. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her, and leaving Charles alone with the divorce papers and the ruins of what had once been the most important relationship in his life. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside the palace walls, a marriage that had survived decades of scandal and pressure had finally been destroyed not by external enemies, but by the failure to understand that some things must be held sacred, beyond the reach of political calculation. Charles sat in the empty room, staring at the document that would end his marriage, and realized that in trying to save the monarchy by sacrificing his wife, he had lost both. The institution would survive, but it would do so without the moral authority that comes from standing for something beyond mere survival. The foreign intelligence services would find their leak irrelevant now, their carefully planned attack rendered moot by a development they had never anticipated. The Queen Consort would resign not because of political pressure, but because of a principle that transcended all their calculations. And Charles would learn, too late, that there are some prices too high to pay for any crown, and some choices that reveal so much about character that they change everything, even when the circumstances that prompted them have passed. In the end, Camilla had taught him the most important lesson of his reign, that a monarchy without honor is not worth preserving, and a king who cannot distinguish between love and political strategy is not worthy to rule. The lesson came at the cost of everything they had built together, but perhaps that was the only way it could have been learned. As the afternoon light faded from the windows of their former shared sitting room, Charles understood that he was now truly alone with the crown he had sacrificed so much to wear, and with the knowledge that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat.